Good afternoon to all of you, where if you're in the afternoon where you are. I know to Dr. Richard Claydon, where you are, it's in the evening. So good evening to you in Hong Kong. And also thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us. I saw your discussion when Hilton was referring to you. Then that's when I said, let me talk to this man. He has got a lot to share. So that's why we ended up inviting you to do a presentation to Zimbabwe HR professionals and some managers, and we hope that they'll benefit a lot. So I will hand over to you now so that you can introduce briefly yourself and just talk briefly about Hong Kong, because we just before we started, we were talking about you've got less than 100 cases in Hong Kong, and I wanted to find out how we have done it when other countries are now in thousands and millions of cases. Over to you, Dr. Claydon.
Okay, thank you, Emery. So my name is Richard. I teach leadership for Macquarie Business School, previously Macquarie Graduate School of Management, on their global MBA program, and currently ranked number 6 in the world. And this would be, if you took that module, this would be the add-on that I don't actually teach at the end of the module, but it's sort of an additional lecture, perhaps. I'm based in Hong Kong, as Memory said, and I run a CEO of a group of disruptive thinkers called the Round Pegs, and we are trying to do cutting-edge leadership development and organisational development work in Hong Kong. So before I start, Memory asked me to talk a little bit about how we've done so well with the coronavirus. And there are a number of things that happened in Hong Kong that have been very interesting to observe. So the first thing you have to take into account is Hong Kong has gone through this before with SARS. So you had a public that had experienced a major coronavirus previously and had sort of were well educated in how to act. Now, the day Wuhan shut down was the day we got the first coronavirus case in Hong Kong. And it was quite incredible. I was in my office, and it was announced while I was in my office. I didn't know about it. And as I walked out of the office, everybody was in a face mask. I mean, everybody. You went from maybe 5% of the population in face masks, which is pretty standard in the flu season, to 95% of the population in face masks within about 3 hours. And this was people within the office as well as in the metros. So that's the sort of the first thing that happened, was everyone was in a face mask immediately. The second thing that happened was a real focus on cleanliness. We already have incredibly clean public transport. So when you're in a public transport, it's spotless. But what happened with the private industries is they put temperature measurements and hand sanitizer at the entrance of the lobby. So before you go into a building, they checked your temperature and you had to wash your hands. So you had all of that sort of sanitizing going on. After that, the government had a sort of a non-mandatory but advisory work from home protocol. So within about 5 days of the first case, everybody worked from home for 2 weeks. It was mandatory for government employees, but nearly all private industries did as well. The schools were then shut about a week later and have remained shut since. So secondary schools have just gone back this week, but primary schools are still off. So if you put all of that together, this sort of rapid response from the public, we've ended up with only 1,000 cases. The first surge, we had about 270. And then when we were quarantining the airport and making people go in 2 weeks quarantine when they were coming back in, we had a 4-day sort of period before that went into effect after it was announced. And we got about 700 cases from people flying back from Europe and America that were quarantined. I think one of the last 2.5 weeks, we've had a few cases reported, but most of the last 2.5 weeks has been 0 cases a day, and we have less than 100 live cases. So that's sort of what the Hong Kong response has been. And as I said to Memory previously, we are the most densely populated developed city in the world. So it's a very similar, our average density is the same as the highest density in New York, in Manhattan. So you can make a sort of comparison about the two cities, and you can see what can be done with this incredible public response. And it really was a public response. It was the public reacting before the government did.
Okay.
So I'm happy to answer any questions on that at the end as well. But I'll go into into the presentation. So this presentation, as I said, is a presentation that I would give sort of as a post-MBA presentation. And it's around the death of Superman and the birth of the Avengers. Now, my superpower tonight is hopefully staying awake. This is about my third 18-hour day in a row. It's fantastic. You end up doing Zoom calls with all these countries that you've never interacted with before. So I've done Lebanon and Zimbabwe and Portugal and New Zealand and all kinds of places. So I'm really enjoying it. But Thursday is the last day of a lot of late night Zoom meetings. So I'm hoping I can stay awake and also stay engaging. And sort of the core of this presentation is you already know all of this. So what I'm actually going to tell you is stuff you already know at a popular consciousness level about what leadership and what good leadership looks like. And that's because if you think of sort of cinema history over the last 10, 15 years, the Avengers films have done incredibly well, and Superman films haven't. And there's a reason for that, and that's how I'm going to try and frame this discussion. Why are we not interested in Superman, and why are we interested in the Avengers? Hopefully, there we go. So, this is a slide on the death of Superman. There is actually a comic series where Superman dies, and this is Lois Lane comforting or cradling his dead body. So it's they've tried to kill him off in the comics as well, because he's not actually that an interesting character, other than one thing, and this is the one thing that sort of makes him interesting. He's not that interesting, firstly, because he's all powerful. All he has to do is turn up and he wins, because he's this incredible superhero. He's far greater than any human could be. And in the films, they have to come up with ridiculous plots because there's nothing on Earth that he can't do. So this is this incredible superhero figure, and we know that that's not realistic and it's not interesting. What is interesting is this critique. So this is from Kill Bill, actually, and this is some dialogue in Kill Bill about Superman. And the character Bill says, Superman didn't become Superman, he was born Superman. When he wakes up in the morning, he's Superman. His alter ego is Clark Kent. And the argument that he makes is Clark Kent is how Superman views us. And the characteristics of Clark Kent is that he's weak and he's a coward. And that Clark Kent is Superman's sort of critique of the whole human race. And I find that a really interesting piece of dialogue in this movie. So it's the idea that if we're going to separate those who lead us from those who follow, are those who follow being critiqued as not ever being capable of being a leader? Is there something that makes the leader super and the rest of us not super? And does someone who gets into that super position critique the rest of us as not being good enough, like this quote? And that I found that a very interesting way of trying to understand Superman, is that within the leadership domain is that there's something special about those who lead that the rest of us don't have. And then that the people who lead critique the rest of us as not really being good enough. And so here's some examples. So Carlyle, so sort of the original leadership theory, and it's a great man theory from 1841. And his argument is, genius is not about putting all of us together, collaborating and solving problems. Genius is the result of one great person always. So we can't become a group of us aren't equal of Napoleon, and a group of poets aren't equal to a Shakespeare. There's something incredibly special about some of these people, and it's their innate talent that lifts them up, and it's the same for leaders. And the argument that sort of comes out of Carlyle's work, I don't know if Jordan Peterson has made any impact on Zimbabwe, but it's the kind of argument that Jordan Peterson makes, that potentially great people are being brought down by the tyranny of equity of outcome. Now, equity of outcome is every single position should be filled equally by requisitely diverse identity groups. So you don't ever try and elevate somebody because of their special talents. You give everyone the opportunity, and each strata of society is filled with an equally requisite diverse identity group. And his argument, and you can agree with it or not, his argument is you have to give everybody the access to the potential of becoming great. So you have to give them all the opportunity to develop and to flourish. but you can't just fill positions equally. That doesn't allow us to find the next Napoleon, the next Shakespeare, and the next Einstein. So that's sort of the original leadership theory almost, and it's a very leadership theory that's very Superman related. This second one, the idea of charismatic leaders from Max Weber in 1922, and it's a similar kind of thing, and lots of contemporary leadership theory is underpinned by these ideas. And the special quality of the leader in Weber's work is charisma. And again, charisma is a certain quality of individual personality which sets leaders apart from ordinary men. It makes them sort of supernatural and superhuman in power and qualities. And we cannot learn how to have charisma. It's sort of divine origin, and it sets the leader apart from everybody else. And what we're finding with really contemporary research around charisma is that charisma is sort of leading to personality cults in organizations. So the more that we rely on charisma as a mark of leadership potential, the more actually we risk ending up with toxic leaders who are using their charisma to do what they like, to grab power, manipulate their followers. Now, you don't have to be a bad leader because you're charismatic, but lots of bad leaders get into positions of power because their charisma makes them seem special. But they're not actually that special. It's just they have this charisma. It gets them to the point of leadership, but they're actually incapable of leadership when they get there. And there's some fantastic work by an academic called Thomas Chamorro Premuzic, and he argues that we're getting to the point of having charismatic incompetence. People are likely to tolerate these bad performers who are charismatic. More so than they're allowed to, they will tolerate a high performer who doesn't have lots of charisma. So I don't want to mention the name of any leaders, but you should be able to think of some that are being tolerated by large sections of the society because they're charismatic rather than their ability to perform. And those who are performing, so one of my favorite leaders is the CEO of Zara, who is so uncharismatic that I can never remember his name. But he's actually created a business that has dominated the retail or the fast fashion industry without ever having this level of charisma. He's incredibly competent. He's incredibly high performing, but he doesn't have charisma. And we confuse charisma with the ability to lead. And this goes into some of the contemporary theory. So most business schools nowadays will tell you that the transformational leader is sort of the apex of leadership theory. If you can find people who are capable of being transformational leaders, you're going to have a great leader. And so the first sort of two elements of transformational leader is the idealized influence and inspirational motivation. So they become the ideal role model, they walk the talk, and they can inspire and motivate people through vision and presenting that vision. This is just charisma. It's just two components. It's the same argument that's been made since the 1920s. You've then got a sort of a bit more of a caring element, that they demonstrate concern for the needs and feelings of the followers and help them self-actualize. And part of that self-actualization, flourishing, becoming a better version of yourself, is becoming innovative and creative and challenging the status quo. So this sort of the first half is this motivational role modeling piece, and underneath that is trying to make you develop. If you follow them, you end up becoming a better version of yourself. And as you can see, and here on this slide, I've underlined followers 4 different times. It's all around gathering followers and A, inspiring the followers to follow you, and B, trying to make them better versions of themselves. So again, you've got this idea of a superhuman quality that emanates down from the leader and helps you to develop. Authentic leaders. So this is a sort of, I would argue that we've moved into an era where we're slowly seeing the idea of transformational leaders being replaced by the idea of authentic leaders. And authentic leadership is very, very similar. There's these sort of core components of an authentic leader that makes them super. That's self-awareness. It's having an incredibly high level of self-awareness. You've got the various elements on the slide, and this incredible level of ethics as well, an internalized moral perspective. And what actually happens with an authentic leader is you are so convinced about your own inner capabilities, you reject the external. That's what authenticity means. It's I will not be trapped by cultural norms. I will look inwards and I will find out from my own great inner self how I should act rather than following cultural norms. You then have the way they deal with other members of their team, their followers, and that's around being fair, being open, allowing people to challenge the status quo again, allowing viewpoints, participatory decision making, getting rid of politics, creating an environment where everybody understands their relationships. So again, a huge number of really incredible leadership powers, but not that different from transformational leadership. It's just the idea that you look inwards, and by looking inwards, and the authentic you is superhuman, and you trust that more than you entrust any external state. So this is Bill George, who's the sort of the core founder of authentic leadership, and this is what he argues it looks like. So as you grow, as you mature, you go up you go up through a number of steps. First of all, you get your character formation. This is when your great ethical moral self begins to form, and then you sort of learn where you're ready up, where you're sort of getting up to the point where you're going to lead. There'll probably be a couple of pitfalls, but then you'll move into your 60s, you're at your peak leadership level, and eventually, in your 70s, 80s, you're sort of the wise guru that everyone should be listening to. So it's a sort of a lifelong journey of authenticity, and as you go through it, you become a better and better leader. And that's very similar to an academic called Robert Keegan, and he talks about also going through the same process. And you can see here that you've got the same sort of graph. You've got it's like a set of steps that you go through. And this is the idea that a lot of people, they just become socialized by society. They follow the rules. They don't step up and lead. Then eventually they can actually look inwards and start self-authoring, and they learn to lead. They have their own compass, their own ethics, their own ability to problem solve. And eventually they become almost meta. They're able to gather all these meta powers, and they're now really learning to lead. They can hold all the contradictions. They can talk to people with different opinions. They extract problems from the immediate environment. They have all these interdependencies with people that they rely on and who rely on them. And they're sort of in that wise guru phase again. The problem with all of these theories, and you can see in the top right there, that only really 1% of people are ever found out, sort of gets to that point. Now, if only 1% of people can ever become leaders, we have a bit of a problem. We need more people capable of leading in all organizations than just 1%. And the other element of the theory is it takes a lifelong to get there. So if you're trying to develop leaders today and someone says to you, well, we'll put them on this developmental course, and it's a lifelong journey, you're not actually going to have any leaders now. And that's what we need. So if you look at Deloitte's research on leadership, they actually argue that only, or they look at what multinationals are reporting, only 7% of multinationals say that they can develop young leaders, and only 14% say they've got somebody on the bench. So we don't have enough leaders now, but the process of developing leaders takes so long that we're not able to develop them. So this is what we end up with. So this is Travis Kalanick, Elizabeth Holmes, and Adam Newman. So these are all of these charismatic leaders with these incredible visions to change the world, who have possibly cost their investors more money than I think Elizabeth Holmes might be very close to or in prison already. This is the challenge, is that the actual leadership development is very expensive. It's outdated. It's infected by charlatans who are just there to take your money, but don't actually know what they're doing. It's incredibly poorly regulated. It takes too long. We don't actually identify high potentials and evaluate their readiness to lead very well. So there's an argument that every organization has 30% of their employees are high potentials, and you don't know they exist. They just fly underneath the radar. Very few people, because of the process, ever reach the kind of graduation level that you want. And because it's so difficult to learn, it adds so much cognitive complexity and emotional intensity to what is already, for many of us, an incredibly overwhelming workload. And at the moment with COVID, it's even more overwhelming. So even if you go to the leadership development programs, it's just more than you can handle. So the output of this is sort of, oh, I've gone a slide too far, sorry. The output of this is, first of all, huge money gets spent on this, a huge amount of time, and there's no guaranteed outcome. What we get are generally two things. First of all, you get well-rounded mediocrities. In order to go through this development, you have to get all of your competencies up at certain levels, and then you're sort of seen as being ready for the next level of leadership. But unfortunately, you're very talented at some, and you don't spend much time on those, and you're not very talented in others, and you've got to become better at them. So your great talents, you don't become really great at, and the things you're not so good at, you get a bit better at. So you become pretty mediocre at everything. If you're not lucky, you get nihilistic ennui, which is I've just become overwhelmed by the complexity. I've had to just spend so much time studying stuff that I'm not good at, that I just give up. I don't see any point of doing this anymore. So that's what we're seeing with sort of the output of the standard leadership development program, and with the numbers that between 7 and 14% of leadership programs are successful. That sort of that frames, unfortunately, what we're seeing. So the second part of the argument is, if Superman is dead, we've got the Avengers, and the Avengers people watched. The Avengers is one of the most successful cinematic experiences ever. 20-odd films, huge box office successes. So there's something going on in the Avengers that makes it a bit more real and a bit more popular consciousness level. There's something real here, whereas Superman, it's not real. And I'll try and go through what I think that is, and then how we can start developing leaders from sort of that initial understanding. So with the Avengers, so I've sort of listed 6 of them here. All of them are wearing leadership masks that are covering some weaknesses. So Tony Stark, or Iron Man, early on he's incredibly brash, he's egotistical, he's a heavy drinker. Bruce Banner and the Hulk, well, obviously he's angry and he's violent and he's got no purpose at all, because he becomes this green anger monster. Steve Rogers, or Captain America, he has this incredible naive idealism. He's melancholic and he's stubborn. So again, major weaknesses. Peter Parker and Spider-Man, you've got a fear of responsibility, mood swings and immaturity. Black Widow, a lack of trust, manipulative and poor self-worth. Thor, rage, a lack of self-worth. And recklessness. So you've got all of these characters have got weaknesses which they try to mask, and they've got their individual films, and then they've got the film The Avengers, where they come together, and I think that's really quite important. So when they come together, something happens. This is not a new idea. Okay, same as the idea of a sort of a Superman leadership is not a new idea. This is actually even older, that the leader has a fatal character flaw. So if you go back through history, the way we've evaluated leadership through drama since ancient Greece, Achilles and Odysseus, hubris, they were overly proud. Theseus, impulsive and reckless. Oedipus, who's my favourite, he's hasty and he has an overtrust in his own intellect. He's too clever for his own good. Faustus had a lust for certainty, he couldn't deal with doubt. Hamlet, procrastination, again, overthinking, too much belief in his own intellect. Macbeth, blind ambition, unreflective loyalty. So the idea that leaders also have fatal character flaws is 2,500 years old. And we've sort of forgotten it because of these superheroic leadership theories, the idea that leaders should be supermen and they're great characters. The idea that they have to cope with their flaws, and their flaws are as much part of them as their strengths, is something that is deeply part of us. And I think the Avengers films talk to, but we've forgotten because leadership theory doesn't talk to it. So one of the reasons leadership theory doesn't talk to it is because you don't go to a leader and start talking to them about their weaknesses and their ego, etc., because you don't sell your leadership development course then. We are seeing some evidence that is beginning to happen, but actually most of the leadership theory just talks about the strengths and how incredible people are. So this is the slide I'm always worried about. So this is how I think we need to understand leadership. So for me, you've got research on different types of research in leadership. This is an organizational studies argument from the 1980s, and I think you can apply it to leadership studies as well. So research in leadership can be generalizable, accurate, or simple, but it can't be all three. It can only ever be 2 out of the 3. What you want to have is generalizable and accurate theories. But if then you can't be simple. Leadership is complex, and therefore it's not simple to understand. It's a very, very complex set of ideas, and it's difficult to get people to it. So I've just written in a number of theorists at the bottom. I could have added a few more, but they're generalizable and accurate, and I will go into slides and show you what they talk about. It's not the popularly conscious way of understanding leadership. What we then have is people who write stuff or teach leadership who try to be accurate and simple, but it can't be generalizable. So a lot of MBAs will have case studies. A lot of popular books on leadership will be biographies. Now, whereas they're quite useful in their accurate and simple characterizations of somebody's life or a case in an organization, you can't generalize it across all organizations, because the organization that you're going to be trying to lead in is completely different from the one they were trying to lead in. It's got a different geography, it's got a different product, it's got a different set of people, it's got a different market problem, etc., etc., etc. So while they're useful, they're not things that you can generalize. Now, if you try to be generalizable and simple, you can't be accurate. So this is where I think a lot of books around leadership sit at the moment. So you can see on my slide, I've put Start With Why, which is Simon Sinek's book, which is incredibly popular. Now, for me, it's simple. It says something useful about leadership, and it's generalizable. He sort of says, well, as long as you start with why, you're going to move into a great leadership position. But it's not accurate. Starting with why doesn't make you a great leader across all organizations. It might be one component of leadership, but it's not all components of leadership. It is not complex enough. The simplified personality theories, it drives me mad when you sort of have organizations that are still investing in personality theories from the 1950s and the 1940s, where we've gone so much further in understanding it. Yet they're sort of saying, well, this is what a leadership profile looks like. But it's not anymore. And again, they're these fuzzy things where it makes everyone feel quite good. So the argument here is, if you say all three, you say nothing worth listening to. If you try to be generalized and accurate, it's very difficult and you get no readers. So most of them are the other two. But if you only focus on the other two, you don't get great leaders. So you've got to try and navigate your way between these 3 different ways of understanding leadership. I'll try and explain a bit more in some of the other slides. So this is just one of a couple of the generalizable and accurate theories. And this is sort of an illustration of how the language is incredibly different from the standard language about leadership. So Heifetz on the left, he talks about technical adaptive challenges, holding environments and productive zones of tension, the role of authority versus the exercise of leadership, work avoidance, reflection in action. These are not common terms about leadership. These are all things that you've got to get towards. You've got to understand the complexities around them in order to do it. Now, I'll just explain the top one, technical and adaptive challenges. A technical challenge, you can just get an expert to solve because he's done it before, and you don't have to, you know what the cause and effect is, you can come and fix it. An adaptive challenge is a little bit like COVID. You don't know what the cause and effect is. We're trying to work out how we stop people getting infected, and every different country is trying to respond in different ways, and you're experimenting with what the response is. Some work, some don't. I'm lucky enough to be living in a country where that worked, but that's an adaptive challenge. You don't necessarily have an expert who comes in with the answer. And Heifetz argues that that's what good leadership looks like. It's knowing when the challenge is technical, knowing when it's adaptive, and changing the way you behave in relation to the challenge that comes up and you're having to deal with. Again, if anyone has any other questions about any of this, I'll answer it in the Q&A. On the other side, you've got Talbot action leadership, action inquiry leadership model. And again, if you look at the names there, here are 8 different levels of leadership. So number 1 is the lowest level, and number 8, Ironist, is the highest level. Again, these are terms, especially 7 and 8. The idea that a leader is an alchemist, somebody who turns base metal into gold, somebody who's a magician, who creates magic out of nothing in order to drive the organization forward. This is not a common way of talking about leadership. And again, they're an ironist, someone that doesn't take anything that seriously, but has a joy in trying to solve things at the same time. And if you look at the 2% and the less than 1%, very, very few people ever get there as well. So this is a standard sort of model. We don't get enough people up there. Most of our good leaders are sort of at level 5 and 6, which is individualist and strategist. Unfortunately, we also have some leaders who are opportunist, and they really just, they don't have any diplomacy. They don't have any other way of seeing the world other than what's in it for them. So again, a bunch of phrases and terms that aren't commonplace in many organizations. Here's another one. So this is Ron Warren's work. So if you look on the left, you've got the drivers and derailers of leadership. Now you will see another set of steps. We've already had a few slides with a set of steps, but Ron's work is different because at the bottom of the steps in the red, you've got derailers. These are the weaknesses rather than just the strengths. So you've got tension, approval seeking, competitiveness, need to control, dependence, hostility, and rigidity. You've got to deal with them as well as the drivers. You can't just focus on the strengths. You've got to focus on the weaknesses. On the right-hand side here, again, you've got, this is how he tries to evaluate a leader. If you're great at the top, then you're a great leader. If you've got anything in the bottom, that can undermine all of your capabilities, because if you're too hostile, you're not going to have anybody listening to you. Here's another one. So this is the Ledecker model, where you've got all of these different dimensions of leadership. And as you can see, it's very similar to Ron Warren's, but it's increased even further. You've got multiple ways of trying to interpret leadership. Sometimes you've got, on the bottom left, you've got complying, which is a weakness. So you've got being passive, trying to belong, trying to please. On the right, you've got strength, the task stuff, and the creative stuff. It's a really difficult system. And very, very few, very, very few people even understand this enough to start teaching it. But again, it has strengths and weaknesses. You've got to understand your character flaws as well as your strengths. So given that's the situation, given that really interesting leadership theory is also really complex, and it seems to take a long time to develop people. So 10, 15 years to get people up to those right levels. We don't have time for that. So what can we do? So I'm going back to sort of ancient Greece here a little bit. The idea of heroes, Alazons, and Eirons. So for me, the hero, the classic heroic leader, they're very uninteresting. We're only talking about the superpowers, none of the major character stuff that makes this person interesting. So for me, they just become a blank cipher. You've got the Superman they're not interesting. It's the villains, the fools, and the tricksters that become interesting. And at one level, one of the most interesting things is the Alazon, or the blocker. Now, the blocker is a character that normally is in a position of power that's actually blocking quite talented people from doing interesting work. So you've got the heavy-handed father figure, the vainglorious soldier, the learned crank, and the obsessed pedant. They block all kinds of innovation, all kinds of creativity. And I think if all of you think of your organization, you'll know who they are in your organization. Now, the thing I'm most interested in, and I think what good leadership is going to come to look more and more like, is the facilitating trickster. Again, it's a bit like the Ironist that we looked at in the Talbot stuff. It's characters who are witty and clever, and poke fun and play around with meaning and do interesting things. And again, I've just got a bunch here from different times in history. So on the left, we've got Jeeves and Sherlock Holmes and Puck and Ariel, all characters from sort of English literature. In the middle, we've got Doctor Who, Columbo, and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So my Zoom background is Doctor Who's TARDIS. And on the right, we have Machiavelli, Cicero, and Socrates. So classic figures who we still remember today, who were doing this kind of facilitating work. They were prodding and probing reality. They were doing it seriously and unseriously at the same time. They were elegant and they were witty, and they were doing interesting things. We don't usually look at these people as future leaders, but I think that we should. So when I present this slide, this is of course the standard response. That's ridiculous. I'm not going to tell my boss. He should be more like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So Buffy the Vampire Slayer is an 18-year-old high school student who kills vampires for a living. And yeah, of course not. That's not what we're trying to say. What we're trying to say is that actually, like in Buffy and in the Avengers, most leadership is learnt on the job, not through leadership development programs. Great leadership reveals itself in moments of extreme challenge, when the team has to rely on each other's strengths and cover for each other's weaknesses. Now, I don't know how popular rugby union is in Zimbabwe, but this is what the All Blacks do. You know, the most dominant rugby union team in the world, and have been forever. And what they do when they play the opposition is they go, right, your opposite number. Are you stronger than him or weaker than him? If you're stronger than him, if you're a better player than him, how do we enhance your strength so that you can dominate that player? If you're a weaker player than them, how as a team do we cover those weaknesses so we as a team win? And sort of the argument we make here is if 20, people in their mid-20s playing sport can do this, and they can say, yeah, I'm not so good. Why can't executives? Why can't you say to an executive, you know what, your weakness is, this is a weakness, you need to be covered for this weakness. So for me as well, so once you sort of get past that, it's the idea that leadership is a quality of the team, not of an individual. And that's what we're experiencing in a VUCA world. So VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. A perfect example, of course, is COVID-19. This is, something totally unexpected. It is changing the way we're all doing things. That's what a VUCA world looks like. Other unexpected things are going to come. We're not sure what's going to cause them, etc., etc. So the leadership becomes something about the quality of the team, not of the individual. So in order to create great leadership, we actually must create our own versions of the Avengers Tower, the Doctor's TARDIS, or Buffy's Library to enable rapid development of leadership. So it doesn't take 20 years, but it takes maybe 18 months, and it's learned in practice and it's learned in a team. So we then, instead of building superheroes, we're trying to build a superheroic environment which enables the entire team to flourish. So then you've got some interesting concepts. So first of all, psychological safety. Now, lots of people, it's very trendy, psychological safety. But really the four core elements of psychological safety is, are you creating an environment where it's safe to ask questions, to admit mistakes, to offer ideas, and to challenge conventional thinking or the status quo? If people can't admit a mistake because they are going to be seen as incompetent, they can't ask a question because they're going to be seen as ignorant, or people are going to accuse them of being ignorant. They can't offer an idea because they're being intrusive, or they can't challenge convention because they're being seen as negative. It's not a psychologically safe environment, and leaders won't develop. You've then got the radical transparency. So that's both strategic and interpersonal. So radical transparency is, do we all have the right information to make decisions? And this could be across the organization. Do we understand the strategic direction? Do we have all of the right stuff coming into us so we can contribute to this leadership development platform in the environment? And interpersonal is, do we understand each other's strengths and weaknesses? Have we done the kind of evaluation program where I say, well, you're great at this, but you're not good at this, so therefore I'm going to hold you accountable for A, but I've got your back when it's B? Are we developing in an area where we can be collectively intelligent? So none of us are as smart as all of us. So every brain can contribute. We can all sense the environment. We can all start thinking about what solutions look like. So how do we create that? Are we creating a learning agile environment? Are we creating an environment where it's not just how mentally quick you are or how good you are at collecting results. It's also around how do you learn to get on with people who are different from you? How are you learning if change happens and the world unfolds in front of you differently than you expected? How do you change your tactics when that happens? And then what do you learn about yourself when this is going on? Are we having these kind of conversations about learning agility? Are we fully flexible? So COVID is fantastic with the last two. Fully flexible. Are we creating organizations where, you know, I say to my team, I'm going to work from home Monday because I really need to get the focused work out of the way, and then we can talk about it on Tuesday? Or are you just being told you have to come into the office and do the 9 to 5? Do we have this flexibility in how we plan out our day? And if I say, I don't want to come to this meeting because it's a business as usual meeting and actually I've got nothing to say and I don't really need to listen to it, is that allowed? And is that person trusted to do that? And the effortless experience, you know, Zoom is something we're all getting used to. It's making digital collaboration easier and easier, and we can do these kind of webinars. But have we got this kind of experience across the whole organization? Are we creating an organization and an experience where it's absolutely effortless to interact with each other? So the final slide is the I Am Iron Man. So I don't know if people have watched the entire Avengers, the 21 films, but the I Am Iron Man statement, the first Avengers film, or the first of the Marvel superhero films, Tony Stark, Iron Man, he's fully egotistical and self-loving, and he flies down. He's sort of saved the world or defeated a hero, and he's at a press conference, and he's not supposed to say he's Iron Man because it's supposed to be secret, but he's so full of self-love, he says, I am Iron Man. It's sort of, I'm great, I'm amazing, I'm super, I'm incredible. In the last film, because he's now learned through the work he's done with the Avengers, they're covering for his weaknesses, and in covering for his weakness, he grows and flourishes. The last line he says, so he snaps his fingers to save the world and to sacrifice himself, and says, I am Iron Man. And it's the way he's changed over those 20 films, from brash and egotistical to someone who we actually can call a leader. And that's absolutely vital. We know this at a popular consciousness level. That's what leadership looks like. It's overcoming your weaknesses as much as exhibiting your strengths. And if the whole arc of the Avengers universe is that Tony Stark's growth. So in the end, he overcomes his weakness, exhibits his strength, and saves everybody. And that's that, which I hope is 40 minutes because I haven't been watching the time.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Claydon. Very interesting perspective on leadership. I will ask a few questions, then allow others to ask questions. My first one is, you talked about charismatic incompetence.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that? How can someone be charismatic and then be incompetent?
Without mentioning any specific politicians in the Western world, you've seen it. I mean, charisma is not necessarily charisma in terms of I am going to there's socialized and personalized charisma. So socialized charisma is I'm going to use all my charisma to make a better world. Mm-hmm. Personalized charisma is I'm going to use all my charisma to benefit myself. Mm-hmm. So you can have a dark charisma as well as a light charisma. If you've got the ability to be charismatic, and that whole bunch of elements of charisma can be learned. It's how you move, it's how you use rhetoric, it's how you enter the room. It can just be how tall you are, how much hair you've got, etc., etc. It's not necessary. It doesn't necessarily align with a good character. So it can be used for good or evil, basically. Yeah.
What would you? How would you then describe people who are not charismatic but are also incompetent?
Well, if they're not charismatic and incompetent, then they're never going to get to a leadership position. What we want to find, if they're charismatic and competent, great. Okay, that's fantastic. That's sort of, they can lead, they can manage, they can do the work. If they're uncharismatic and unincompetent, they're never going to be picked. What we need to find is we need to focus more on competence than charisma.
Mm-hmm.
So our, that if you look at, so the founder of IKEA, the founder of Zara, who, again, I can never remember their names because they're not in the press all the time showing how wonderful they are,
Mm-hmm.
but they've created wonderful companies. So they're not charismatic. They don't go out and self-promote, but they've done an incredible job building companies that everyone has heard of. But whilst being out of the spotlight. So they have all the competence in spades without necessarily having to have the charisma.
Yeah. You also seem to suggest that leadership comes through experience, and we are wasting a lot of money through leadership development. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I have so most leadership development theories, they're coming out of the 1970s and the 1980s. It's a very, very different world that we're living in. So there's two different elements. One is you've got outdated models. Okay? So if I'm going to use something like DISC to work out if someone can be a leader, it's so outdated. It's not true. If I'm going to use some of the trait theories, that extroversion equals leadership. Well, no, it doesn't. We know it doesn't. It's a theory from the 1930s, but it's no longer an established theory. Even situational leadership, it's one of my favorite examples. So a lot of people still use it. So situational leadership sort of had two levels historically. Originally it was about white collar managers leading blue collar employees. So as the blue collar employee got more experience, you could delegate more work to them. It then became about white collar managers leaving white collar employees. So they sort of changed the model, but it was a similar kind of thing that as they, rather than maturing as they developed, that they were getting to the level of leadership themselves. But it assumes that you can coach the person. Mm-hmm. Now you can't necessarily coach someone to lead in a job that you don't understand. And when we're doing lots of cross-functional work, you can't coach and delegate when you don't understand the job. And lots of the jobs that we're leading, the jobs of the people we're leading are beyond our comprehension because they're new. It's a new technology. It's a new way of looking at the world. How do you lead someone and inspire them to do something when you don't really understand what they're doing? Mm-hmm. So you've got all of that sort of stuff that's out of date. Mm-hmm. So then you've got the developmental psychology stuff. So the idea that you've got all these different stages of development, and you can generally get people there after 20 years, which is a great set of theories, but is not practical. Mm-hmm. So the practical stuff is outdated. The good stuff is not practical. So we've got to come out and find something else. So the way that I look at it, and I think, so Morgan sort of asked a question, how can leadership in organizations be developed to perform like the All Blacks rugby team? It's sort of the idea that, they take responsibility for themselves as a team. And you can rapidly select and develop, train them, get them into a space where they understand each other and they understand what to do. And then you send them out. So I think we're going to get to a stage where the selection and the development of the team, because we're getting better technologies that can select the qualities and find out what the strengths and the derailers are. I think we're going to be able to do it in a week. So you go into the organization, you do your profiles, you find out who have got the right set of spikes to get into a team together, and without enough derailers. So all of the various competencies and talents are covered. You do a sort of a 3-day prep on how do you create what in this slide I call a superheroic environment, but really it's just a leadership environment. How do you have each other's backs? How do you understand what you have to do? You do a week to prep that, and then you put a communication system where they can talk back to headquarters about what's going on, and then you let them learn from each other as they're doing the work. Mm-hmm. And they go out and do 18 months of something, and they come back so it's like a leadership squad. It's almost a SWAT team, and then they come back. You debrief them, and you find out what they learned, and you add that to your corpus of knowledge around leadership, and then you go again. Mm-hmm. So it's an ongoing iterative process, a bit like Agile should be an iterative process. Yeah,
I've got two more questions. The other issue is we are from Hong Kong, and got less than 100 cases of COVID. You were outlining that from day one, everyone was putting on a mask. Everything is squeaky clean in terms of the environment. When you put the models that you were showing us in the context of COVID-19, in terms of how it is across the globe we've managed COVID-19, what are the lessons for people?
Interesting.
I know it's a tough one.
No, it's a good one. It's a good one. So, I mean, so Hong Kong is reasonably unique because we had the experience, but you've still got this sort of personal responsibility and accountability in the people. That everyone acted immediately, and then not only did they take responsibility for themselves, they started making sure there was hand sanitizers everywhere. The private industry reacted, so you had something very interesting going on there. You've then got, I guess, you've sort of got a more scientific versus less scientific responses. So you've got countries that sort of the leaders sort of said, I'm going to listen to I'm going to work in collaboration with the experts from the off, and we're going to do what historically works, which is test and trace and shut down, and rather than experiment, then we can experiment once we've done what we've already done. What happened in some of the other countries is they just experimented from the off. Or politics got in the way, or ideology got in the way, and they didn't. There was a difference between the science and the politics, etc., etc. And you could argue that in some of the countries that haven't done well, that sort of charismatic populism has got in the way as well. In that it's all around, I want to be the charismatic leader rather than I want to deal with a problem like this. So I don't think there's enough data in yet, because you might find that in 12 months it ripples back through Hong Kong and we have a disaster. But there's something that's going to happen, I think, in that, the traditional countries where all of the traditional leadership theory has come from. So mainly North America, but a little bit out of the UK as well. So it's, if I look at the leadership course I teach at the MBA, it's old white men, most of whom are dead. Most of whom are from the States. That's the dominant set of theories. But you look at how the world has responded, and it's countries led by old white men haven't done very well. Countries underpinned by these leadership theories haven't done very well. There's something else going on in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in Australia, where they've responded in a very different way and have done things better than these old school leadership models. So at some point we're going to learn something interesting about that, but we need more data to know exactly what it is.
Well, one of the thing that we're debating on Twitter today with others is that relate to when you look at CEOs of companies, some were arguing that the best CEOs are those that have got technical domain knowledge in a particular industry. For example, if it's medical, you must have a medical doctor. If it's engineering, you must have an engineer. What has been your experience, and how do you apply your models to this?
Yes and no, I think. I would say you can have. So let's look at IBM under Lou Gerstner as an example. So Lou Gerstner was CEO of, or was at Coca-Cola from memory before he went to IBM, and yet revitalized IBM. So he came out of a space where it was a very different set of products. He wasn't an engineer, he wasn't into computers, and went into a computer industry and sort of revitalized it. You've even also sort of Steve Jobs, when he first left Apple and went to Pixar. And as owner of Pixar, he revolutionized an industry he knew nothing about. So there's some kind of high-level generalism that a very, very small percentage of leaders have, where you can switch between organizational type and you can do this kind of, that 1% I talked about. But I think that's unusual. I think that a lot of people, you want to have, you sort of want to be soaked in the practices that you're trying to lead in. at the same time be open enough to see that there are different ways of doing it. So you don't want to be rigidly soaked. You want to be soaked but open at the same time. And I think that's one of the challenges. So Adam Grant talks about we've lost the notion. So we've become so specialized that even within your own, so people will go through their whole industry doing finance rather than doing, you know, finance and sales and marketing and ops. And so if you can generalize within an industry, so there needs to be some generalization, and it could be within an industry rather than across industries. So it's a difficult balance, but I think you do need both. So you need so Kenneth Mickelson, who's one of the more interesting writers in this space, he talks about neo-generalists, that sort of a new level of generalism where we are both hyper specialized and hyper generalist simultaneously. And how do you create a career path that enables that? And again, it's very new thinking, but I think that's where we're going.
Yeah, interesting. Let me open up the session to others who may want to talk directly to you in terms of questions. Yes. If there's anyone with a question, please just unmute yourself and then ask your question. Questions, or I can continue. Yeah, while they're thinking, Thomas Chamorro, you were highlighting that he was the one talking about charismatic incompetence, but he also talks about derailment, which is an issue that you highlighted. And I was reading somewhere where they were highlighting that leadership derailment was costing America close to about 36 billion somewhere per annum.
Yes.
What has been your experience with leadership derailment?
So my favorite my favorite guy in that space is Ron Warren. I think Ron Warren is his work on derailment, and he's done stuff at Yale and Harvard. It's fantastic stuff. I think it's too fuzzy leadership. You get scared when people get up to those executive levels. You're sort of too scared of telling them that they've got these derailers that are costing. You're not measuring them anymore. You know. So for example, the most popular personality traits tool is the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which for me is sort of a simple and generalizable way of looking at personality. It's got no negatives. You're not looking at derailers. It's fuzzy and it's like positive, and which is why so many organizations use it, because it sort of everyone feels good about themselves when they do it, and there's a degree of use and how you should talk to each other. So one thing is we don't talk enough about derailers from the off, because it's, you know, people don't like to buy that kind of stuff. Although you've got companies like Bridgewater who do all the time and outperform the market massively. At the other level, you've sort of got, in lots of industries and lots of companies, you have to be ruthless to be promoted. So actually some of these derailers get you into positions of leadership. So the whole thing of what got you here won't get you there. So the ruthlessness and the hostility and the rigidity and pushing your way upwards and pushing through all the obstacles. Yeah, it gets you into a leadership position, but it doesn't mean you can lead. And that's a challenge as well. So I think we need to be, and again, so the argument I make about the All Blacks, if we can tell 20-year-old rugby players that they're not good enough at certain elements of their work, then we should be able to tell leaders that they've got, they're too hostile or too rigid. They should be able to deal with that and respond. And Ron does it incredibly well, but he is one of a very, very small group of people doing that commercially. And it's not enough.
Yeah, Dr. Thomas Chamorro says there's too many incompetent men in leadership positions.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I think you've got some raised hands now, Memory.
Yeah?
You've got some raised hands. Morgan's raised a hand, yeah.
Okay, let me give Morgan an opportunity. Morgan, you can go ahead. Morgan?
Has he unmuted himself?
Morgan, go ahead.
Hello, Doc.
Hello.
Yeah. Oh yeah, thanks so much. I'm very inspired by your presentation.
Thank you.
The Superman allegories are very, very inspiring. I'm looking at a situation where the structures that we currently have, where the CEO is at the top of the structure of the organization, then it filters down to the rest of us in the company. Then there's a concept of how then does that still work? I mean, given the dynamics that we have right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting with the role, because you're suggesting a role modeling environment, that the CEO is seen as the role model for the whole organization. Is that what you're suggesting?
Where we're looking at, rather than having a structural setup like the ones that we traditionally have, what I noticed with the COVID, that structure is not responsive enough.
Okay, I get you.
Yeah, the dynamics that we have right now. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's sort of an argument that every organization has three different structures going on. So the first one is the formal hierarchy, with the CEO at the top, and then your standard organizational chart. The second one is sort of the informal network, which is, and this is really interesting during COVID, because the informal network has disappeared. This is all the people who know each other and have informal communication with each other and chat to each other over water coolers or coffee or a glass of wine or over lunch or just in the corridor, play cards together, whatever they do. That you've got friendships developing and communications channels developing, etc. So there's a wonderful academic in Sydney called Hilary Armstrong, who sort of looks at organisation communication and where the hubs of communication are, and she looks at what the formal organisation thinks communication looks like versus the informal, and 75% of the people that are the most valuable communicators are not seen as valuable at all in the formal chart. So you've got a disjunction between how we perceive the structure of organisation and how communication flows. And then you've got the value creating part of organization. And the value creating part generally is small teams doing good work well. And that's a separate structure entirely. You know, you've got your little project teams of, you know, maybe 4 or 5 different people who are doing interesting work and potentially doing it well. And we don't even really look at those structures. We don't even look at this as being where the value is created, but it is. So I think already we've got these little internal kind of leadership teams. So the idea in Stanley McChrystal's work, that the idea of team of teams, that all organisations have all these little teams going on, and you know, the more cross-functional they are, it becomes more interesting. But that's where value is created. And as we look at sort of going from an industrial organizational form, which is this classic organizational tree, to a post-industrial organizational form, which is project teams and fluid and agile and all these kind of new ways of thinking, these self-organizing, self-leading teams are going to become more and more important. The challenge is how to be imaginative about breaking down the structures. You're still going to have ultimate responsibility. You can't have an organization without a completely formal structure. That's still going to be part of it, but you've got to let the formal structure interact with the informal structure in a more value creating way. Now, if I could tell you how to do that, I would be worth a lot more money than I am at the moment. But that's what we need to be thinking about. Some organizations claim they've done it quite well. You've got other organizations so you've got Zappos and their holacracy kind of model. They claim they do it quite well. A lot of the big tech companies claim they do it quite well, but you also hear stories coming out of these companies about how the reality of working there is very different from the rhetoric that they're pumping out into the world. So it's an ongoing set of ideas and set of solutions, and at some point something is going to work and it's going to become very trendy and everyone's going to start investing in it, and there are so many people working on it. I have very high confidence that something will happen soon.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Maybe let me take last two questions, then we're done. Any other questions? Doc, I think there are no further questions. You have done justice to this, actually beyond my expectation. I was glued to this. Very exciting. I wish there was no COVID. You could come here and you will mingle and you present to some of our conference,
Hey,
but I will keep in touch.
we can all start flying again at some point. So let's book that in 5 years' time, okay?
Yeah. I'll definitely invite you, and we'll chat online and discuss what else you can present to the community here.
Fantastic.
This is a very
You've
exciting.
got a raised hand. I've still got a few minutes. Yeah.
Okay, let's take that one. Teacher Ona, can you proceed? Teacher Ona?
Make sure you unmute before you speak.
Okay, thank you. In this COVID era, where organizations are also trying to be productive, or at least also trying to protect their employees, what is the best way forward in terms of engaging employees, but also trying to reduce the rate of infection, allowing them to be a bit democratic, but also ensuring that they are safe?
This is another hour-long lecture, but I'll do the best I can. So what again, we sort of try to take a scientific response to this. So I've done a bunch of research, actually, which we might even be releasing tomorrow formally, on what the experience has been across the world on sort of this sudden remote working, work from home element of that we've all had to do. And there's some fascinating research. So I ended up reading 3 or 4 PhDs rapidly to get my head around the research around what remote working actually does to people. And what we've seen is there's something called a perception gap. So there's a perception when remote work becomes available. There's very often a perception that remote work is not real working. You know, it's like taking a sickie, or you're not pulling your weight when you've decided to work from home. And if you've got an organization with a big perception gap, then actually those working from home are not as productive as engaged as those working in the office. However, if you've got a small perception gap or a zero perception gap, then productivity and engagement goes up incredibly if a work from home or a remote working becomes part of the organization. So COVID has killed that perception gap because we're all having to do it. There's no, you're not looking at your colleague and saying, well, you're working from home. You're being a bit lazy, because you're also working from home. So there's no perception gap. So what we found with this lack of perception gap, and I think that's sort of chronological. So initially, we saw high levels of productivity and engagement, like a big surge, because people were going home, they were catching up on the work they've not had time to do in the office. They were rallying around the flag, trying to save the company. So you had this incredible surge of productivity and engagement. What we're finding now is that business as usual practices are being re-injected into the home working experience. So that instead of being productive and engaged, you're feeling overwhelmed. You've got too much video. You're drained. You're not actually having the same experience of what a normal work from home experience would be, because you've got all of the business as usual stuff going in. So that sort of frames where we are. I think where we're going is you're going to have remote working as part of work. We're not going to go back to where everyone is in a tightly controlled central office. I think we're going to see a rise of localized, flexible workspaces, so that you, instead of catching public transport into the city, you just work either in your home or near your home many days a week, and then you go into the city in a sort of almost a passport controlled style way, so that you have the de-densified experience in headquarters when you need to be there. So I think you're going to see a sort of a mix between flex and core and work from home, and then you're going to have, and this is why I've got a reasonable hope that we might start seeing something interesting happen, because you need a reimagination of management to do that. Because we cannot manage a workforce that's that flexible in a hierarchical, non-flexible manner. It's impossible, because it's going to cause a massive drop of productivity, a massive drop in engagement, and it's going to increase mental health challenges, because you're so overwhelmed and isolated all the time, you are going to become mentally ill. So there's going to be some really interesting reimagination of what that looks like. And I think that it could be a kickstart into the kind of organization that perhaps I've envisaged throughout this presentation. It's going to take us a couple of years to get there, but really with some great management training and some great leadership and development training around how to use technologies and how to trust and how to report. And I can share it with memory when we release the research. I think that kind of organization is going to be something that is incredibly inspiring to people. And that's where I hope we go. And so we're safe and productive and engaged simultaneously.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Claydon. I think this was excellent.